The Italian crime figure feared no one. Not the federal task forces. Not the rival street gangs. Not even the shadows that followed him. But the night he sat in his usual velvet booth. A young black waitress leaned in close and whispered, "Keep your head down, they came for you." She slipped a folded note beneath his silver fork. The moment he read it, the jewelry on his hands caught the light as they began to tremble. Because whoever was coming for him was already watching from the next table. Stay with me, because the choice he made in the next 10 minutes would change his life forever. Marzio Trentino had built his empire on the foundation of absolute power. For decades, he survived by mastering the art of the calculated observation. He didn't just walk into a room, he owned the air inside it. Every evening followed the same lethal routine. The same expensive dark suit. The same gold chains catching the candlelight. The same quiet dinner at his favorite upscale haunt, the sanctuary where his word was law. To the other diners, it was a place of crystal glasses and expensive wine. But Marzio didn't see a restaurant. He saw tactical exits. He saw the loyalty of his bodyguard standing like statues behind him. He saw faces he could crush, and faces he had already bought. Because in his world, you didn't just dine. You guarded your throne. That night, the rhythm of his power was interrupted. The usual server was gone. In her place was Anarcha Green. Professional. Focused. But leaning in with an urgency that didn't belong in a five-star establishment. When she arrived with his order, she didn't just set down the plate. She leaned close enough for him to hear her heartbeat. And when she delivered her warning, it meant only one thing. The sanctuary had become a kill zone, and the only person trying to save him was the last person he ever expected to care. The air inside Bellanota smelled of aged balsamic, seared fat, and the heavy, expensive cologne of men who didn't have to ask for prices. Marzio Trentino sat in his corner booth, the high-backed burgundy leather framing him like a throne of his own making. At 58, his presence wasn't just felt, it was an atmospheric pressure that dictated the volume of the room. He adjusted the heavy gold link of his watch, the metal cool against his skin, and let his gaze drift across the dining room with the practiced ease of a predator at a watering hole. To the young couples at the center tables, this was a night of romance and fine wine. To Marzio, it was a tactical landscape. He didn't see a restaurant, he saw a grid of potential trajectories. He noted the two men in the far booth. Newcomers, wearing suits that fit a little too loosely at the shoulders, their eyes darting toward the entrance every time the bell chimed. He catalogued the busboy's unusually frantic pace and the way the maitre d' avoided looking toward the corner booth tonight. Marzio lived in a bubble of calculated observation, a silent space where every clink of a crystal glass against china was a data point in a lifelong equation of survival. His bodyguards, two pillars of silent muscle, stood near the kitchen doors, their arms crossed in a way that signaled both protection and a quiet threat to anyone who dared move too quickly. Marzio took a slow sip of his Barolo, the deep red liquid staining the glass like a premonition. He prided himself on his control, over his city, over his men, and most importantly, over his own emotions. He had long ago discarded the luxury of fear, replacing it with a cold, analytical detachment that had kept him alive while his contemporaries were either underground or behind bars. He felt the weight of his reputation in the way the air seemed to thin as the waitress approached. This was his sanctuary, a place where his routine was a ritual that no one dared interrupt. He expected the usual, the rare ribeye, the silent service, the undisturbed peace of a king in his counting house. But as the young woman drew closer, Marzio noticed the slight hitch in her breath, a deviation from the practiced grace of the Bellanota staff. The Iron Throne felt suddenly cold. He didn't know it yet, but the calculation he had been running for 40 years was about to face a variable he hadn't accounted for, a warning from the one person he had completely overlooked. The ritual of the Friday night ribeye was supposed to be a silent exchange of precision, but as the white-clothed table was approached, the air shifted. Marzio didn't need to look up to know it wasn't the veteran server, Maria. He felt the hesitation in the footsteps, a staccato rhythm that betrayed a lack of tenure in this den of lions. When the shadow fell over his table, he didn't see the usual practiced indifference of the Bellanota staff. Instead, he saw Anar. Green, her knuckles white as she gripped the heavy ceramic plate, her professional facade cracking like fine porcelain under immense pressure. As she leaned in to set the steak before him, the scent of her nervous sweat cut through the aroma of garlic and rosemary. Her hand trembled, a micro-tremor that caused the silver fork to chime against the china with a sound like a distant alarm bell. Marzio's muscles coiled, his calculated observation locking onto the way her eyes darted toward the tall, suited bodyguards behind him, then back to his own intense gaze. She wasn't just serving a meal, she was vibrating with a secret that threatened to consume her. In the dim candlelight, the gold rings on Marzio's fingers remained still, a stark contrast to the young woman's frantic energy as she reached into the pocket of her crisp uniform. The world seemed to slow to a crawl, the ambient noise of clinking glasses fading into a dull hum. Anne leaned closer than protocol allowed, her presence an urgent whisper in his personal space. Her body language was a masterclass in controlled panic, shoulders hunched, head ducked, her entire being acting as a shield between Marzio and the rest of the room. When she finally spoke, the words were barely a breath, a jagged sliver of sound intended only for his ears. "Keep your head down," she murmured, the protective expression in her eyes clashing with the cold reality of her undercover role. "They came for you." Before he could react, he felt the dry friction of paper as she expertly slid a folded note beneath the tines of his fork. It was a movement born of desperation, a pattern interrupt so violent it shattered the bubble of safety Marzio had spent 40 years inflating. She pulled back instantly, her face settling into a mask of rigid professionalism that couldn't quite hide the terror in her soul. She had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and as she disappeared back into the shadows of the kitchen, Marzio looked down at the fork. The steak sat untouched, steaming and redundant, as the cold weight of the note signaled that the hunter had finally become the prey. The dining room of Bellanota continued its rhythmic hum, but for Marzio, the sound had flattened into a distant, underwater drone. His focus was microscopic, narrowed entirely to the silver fork resting atop the white linen. Beneath its polished tines lay the slip of paper that had just dismantled his 40-year streak of absolute certainty. He didn't reach for it immediately. To move too fast was to admit alarm, and in his world, alarm was a scent that drew predators. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the steam from the untouched ribeye warm his face while his mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. With a practiced, fluid motion, the kind used to adjust a cufflink or check a watch, he shifted the fork. The paper was small, rough-edged, and felt impossibly heavy as he palmed it. He lowered his hand to his lap, shielded by the heavy drape of the tablecloth, and unfolded it with the silent precision of a card sharp. The jewelry on his fingers caught the dim candlelight, casting flickers of gold against the dark fabric of his suit. As his eyes tracked the jagged, hurried script, the air in his lungs seemed to solidify. "Keep your head down, they came for you." The words didn't just carry information, they carried the weight of thunder. It wasn't the "they" of a rival family or a common street thug. The phrasing, the clinical, detached warning, pointed toward something far more systemic. The realization hit him with a cold, visceral force that drained the color from his face, leaving his features like carved stone. He felt the phantom pressure of a federal net closing in, a sensation he had spent a lifetime avoiding through bribes, blood, and shadows. But there was a deeper vibration to the message, a resonance that suggested the betrayal was already sitting at the table with him. Image. A high-angle close-up of Marzio's muscular, ringed hand gripping a small, crumpled note beneath the edge of a mahogany table, his expression one of intense, frozen alarm. He refolded the note, his movements now dictated by a cold, survivalist logic. He looked up, his intense gaze sweeping the room once more, but the calculated observation had changed. He wasn't looking for exits anymore, he was looking for the barrel of a gun or the flash of a badge. His bodyguards stood as still as ever, but for the first time, Marzio wondered if their posture was one of protection or containment. The sanctuary was gone. The note had stripped the gold and velvet away, leaving only the raw, jagged bones of a man whose empire was built on sand. He swallowed hard, the taste of the Barolo now bitter on his tongue, as he realized that the young woman with the trembling hand had just handed him the most dangerous gift of his life, the truth. The rain began as a rhythmic drumming against the corrugated metal roof of the abandoned boathouse, a desolate structure miles away from the polished marble of Bellinota. Marzio Trentino stood in the shadows, his expensive dark suit a sharp contrast to the decaying wood and the scent of stagnant river water. He didn't have to wait long. The headlights of a nondescript sedan cut through the downpour, illuminating the silver chains on his neck for a fleeting second before the engine killed. And R. Green stepped out, no longer the trembling waitress in a professional uniform, but a woman carrying the weary, jagged edge of someone who had just set fire to her own life. She walked toward him with a steady gait that lacked the subservience of a server. When she stopped a few feet away, the silence between them was heavy, charged with the ticking clock, tension of two worlds colliding. Marzio didn't reach for his weapon, he simply watched her with an intense, alarmed curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the damp air. And didn't flinch. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a leather case, flicking it open to reveal the cold, unmistakable glint of a federal badge. "Special Agent in Green," she said, her voice devoid of the whisper she'd used at the restaurant. "And as of 20 minutes ago, I'm likely the most wanted woman in the bureau." The revelation hit Marzio with the force of a physical blow. He had spent his career dodging the FBI, but he had never had one hand him a lifeline. And explained the scope of the operation, a multi-year investigation designed to dismantle the Trentino family from the inside out. By slipping him that note, she hadn't just tipped him off, she had compromised a dozen active wiretaps and years of surveillance. It was career suicide, a deliberate act of professional sabotage that would leave her with a target on her back from her own colleagues. Why? Marzio demanded, his brow furrowed as he tried to find the logic in her betrayal. "You're a Fed. You're supposed to be the one putting the cuffs on me, not the one keeping my head down." And looked at him, her protective expression returning, though now it was hardened by the reality of her choice. "Because the files don't show the whole man, Marzio," she replied, the rain slicking her hair back. "And because I don't owe my life to the Bureau. I owe it to you." She watched the confusion flicker across his face, knowing that the man who prided himself on noticing everything had completely forgotten the one moment of mercy that had defined her entire existence. She was no longer just an agent or a waitress, she was a debt coming due, and the cost of that debt was everything she had ever worked for. The rain drumming on the boathouse roof faded, replaced by the roar of a different fire from 15 years ago. Marzio's mind drifted back to a freezing December night in a neighborhood his associates usually avoided unless they were collecting a debt. He had been younger then, his hunger for power still sharp, but that night he was alone, driving through a block of crumbling tenements that looked like hollowed-out ribcages. Then he saw it, smoke billowing from the third floor of a skeletal brownstone, the orange glow of a backdraft licking at the windows. He had stopped the car, not out of heroism, but out of a sudden, inexplicable irritation at the waste of life. Amidst the chaos of the street, he saw a young girl standing on a fire escape that was beginning to pull away from the brick. She was clutching her mother's hand, their faces smeared with soot, trapped by a wall of heat. Marzio didn't call the authorities, he didn't wait for the sirens that were still miles away. He had climbed the rusted metal slats, his expensive leather jacket tearing against the iron, his lungs burning with the acrid stench of melting plastic. Image, a younger Marzio, face streaked with soot and eyes wide with exertion, reaching out to pull a small child and a woman from a window engulfed in orange flames. He remembered the weight of the child as he swung her over his shoulder, a small, terrified girl with braids that smelled of smoke. He remembered the mother's desperate grip on his forearm, a grip that left a bruise he had carried for a week. He had lowered them both to the safety of the pavement just as the fire department's bells began to wail in the distance. Without a word, without giving a name or waiting for a thank you, he had vanished back into the shadows of his idling sedan. To him, it was a deviation from cold logic, a moment of uncharacteristic compassion he had buried beneath a decade of blood and iron. He had viewed it as a weakness, a fragment of the man he was supposed to have killed to become the boss of the Trentino family. Now, standing in the damp boathouse, Marzio looked at the woman holding the FBI badge. He looked at the shape of her eyes, the set of her jaw, and the braided hair now slicked back by the rain. The realization was a slow, heavy ache. The vulnerable insider, who had risked everything to save him tonight, was that same little girl. He had thrown a stone into the water 15 years ago, thinking it would simply sink into the dark. He never imagined the ripples would travel through a decade and a half, across the lines of law and crime, to return to him in a crowded restaurant when he had finally run out of places to hide. The revelation of the past hung in the humid air of the boathouse, but the ticking clock of the present refused to grant them a moment of sentiment. And stepped closer, the protective expression on her face sharpening into the cold, analytical mask of an agent who had seen the underbelly of her own department. She pulled a handheld scanner from her bag, the red laser cutting through the dark as she swept Marzio's expensive suit, finally lingering on the heavy gold watch he had worn for a decade. A sharp, rhythmic beep filled the space. "They aren't just coming for you, Marzio," she whispered, her voice tight with the weight of her choice. "They're already here. The raid on your warehouse tomorrow morning? It's a ghost hunt. A distraction." Marzio looked at his watch, the luxury item now a leaden weight on his wrist. He realized with a jolt of visceral alarm that the very symbols of his power had been turned into the tools of his demise. But the federal net wasn't what made the color drain from his face. It was the realization of how they had gotten close enough to plant a tracker in a watch that never left his sight. He ran through his calculated observation of the last 48 hours, searching for the breach in his ironclad routine. He saw the faces of his inner circle, men he had raised, men he had bled with, and the image of his nephew, the person he allowed himself to trust without reservation, flashed in his mind like a lightning strike. The vultures weren't just the agents in windbreakers waiting in the outskirts of the city. They were the men standing behind his throne at Bellinota. The federal raid was a coordinated cover designed to flush him out, to push him into a secure, secondary location where his own people could finish what the law started. He felt the cold realization that the sanctuary of his organization had become a cage. In his world, a boss who could be tracked was a boss who was already dead. He looked at Anne, the woman who had traded her career for a debt of honor, and for the first time, the muscular crime figure felt the true scale of the isolation he had built. He was a man surrounded by an empire of sand, and the wind was finally starting to blow. "If the warehouse is the distraction," Marzio said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp, "then where is the real trap?" And didn't answer with words. She simply looked toward the city skyline, where the lights of the precinct and the penthouse suites blurred into a single, predatory glow. The hunt wasn't happening tomorrow. It had already begun. The rain intensified, turning the river into a churning expanse of black glass that reflected the neon ghosts of the city skyline. Inside the boathouse, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of water and the distant, mourning wail of a tugboat. Marzio watched Anne, his mind still struggling to reconcile the vulnerable insider with the cold efficiency of a federal agent. He looked at the badge she held, a symbol of a world that viewed him only as a collection of crimes, a monster in the files, to be dissected and discarded. "You're throwing it all away," Marzio said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Your career, your safety, the law you swore to uphold. For a man who hasn't thought about that fire in 15 years. Why? And lowered the badge, her gaze steady and devoid of the nervous tremors that had haunted her at the restaurant. Because the Bureau sees a kingpin. They see racketeering, money laundering, and a body count. They have a paper version of you that is nothing but darkness. She took a step toward him, her silhouette sharp against the gray light of the doorway. But the law doesn't have a memory for the things that aren't on a rap sheet. The files don't mention the man who climbed a collapsing fire escape when the professionals were still 3 blocks away. They don't record the way you didn't even look back to see if we were okay before you disappeared into the smoke. She paused, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. I spent 3 years undercover, Marzio. I watched you from the kitchen, I listened to the wiretaps, and I waited for that monster to show himself. And he's there, I'm not naive. But every time I saw you sit in that booth, noticing every detail, protecting your own. I saw the man from the brownstone. I realized that if I let them destroy you tonight, I'd be destroying the only reason I'm still standing here. The ticking clock of the investigation felt like a physical weight in the room. And was no longer acting as a professional, she had chosen to be human in a world that demanded she be an instrument. She had traded the certainty of her badge for the uncertainty of a debt she could never fully repay. Marzio looked at her, and for the first time in decades, the calculated observation failed him. He didn't see a witness or a threat. He saw a mirror reflecting a version of himself he had tried to kill long ago. The professional facade had vanished, leaving only 2 people caught in the storm, bound by a moment of grace that the law could never understand. The boathouse was a memory now, replaced by the suffocating luxury of Marzio's private study. The clock on the mahogany desk ticked with a ticking clock percussion, counting down the 18 hours remaining before the world was scheduled to collapse. Marzio sat in his leather chair, the heavy gold watch still strapped to his wrist, a ticking beacon for the feds and a testament to his own misplaced trust. When the door opened, his nephew, Tony, stepped in, carrying a bottle of vintage grappa and a smile that had once seemed like the only honest thing in Marzio's life. You left the restaurant early, Zio, Tony said, his voice light, though his eyes didn't quite reach the same warmth. The boys were worried. I was worried. Marzio didn't pour a drink. He leaned forward, the jewelry on his fingers catching the low lamplight as he watched his nephew move through the room. The calculated observation was no longer a passive habit, it was a search for a death warrant. He noticed the way Tony's hand hovered near his jacket pocket, not the pocket where a man keeps his phone, but the one where he keeps a heavy piece of steel. He noticed the way Tony avoided the corner booth of the office, staying close to the exit, his posture mirroring the vultures, and had warned him about. I had a lot to think about, Tony, Marzio said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. About loyalty. About how a man can spend 40 years building a wall, only to find the termite was already inside the wood. Tony froze for a fraction of a second, the smile faltering before it was forced back into place. You're talking in riddles. Is this about the warehouse raid? We have the trucks moving tonight. Everything is secure. Is it? Marzio stood up, the chair scraping against the floor like a blade. He tapped the face of his gold watch. This keeps perfect time, Tony. You gave it to me for my anniversary. You said it was so I'd always know when it was time to come home. He took a slow step toward his nephew, the muscular crime figure now a mountain of silent fury. Does the Bureau know you gave it to me? Or did they provide the tracker themselves? The air in the room turned to ice. Tony's face didn't drain of color, it hardened into a mask of cold, predatory ambition. The trusted associate didn't deny it. The silence was his confession. In that moment, Marzio saw the finality of Anne's warning. The federal raid wasn't the end of the story, it was the signal for the execution. Tony wasn't just an informant, he was the usurper, waiting for the clock to strike 0. As Tony's hand finally dove for his jacket, Marzio realized that the 18 hours had just become 18 seconds. The betrayal was complete, and the man he had loved like a son was the one holding the shovel. The following night, the industrial district was swallowed by the synchronized flash of sirens and the heavy boots of tactical teams. The federal raid on the Trentino warehouse was executed with surgical precision, doors kicked in and flashbangs lighting up the darkness. But as the smoke cleared, the silence that followed was deafening. There were no crates of contraband, no ledger books, and no Marzio Trentino. The vast space was nothing but a hollow shell of empty rooms and the lingering scent of shredded paper. The vultures had arrived to pick at a carcass, only to find that the spirit of the empire had already evaporated into the midnight fog. Marzio didn't look back as he crossed the city limits in a nondescript vehicle, the heavy gold watch. His gilded leash, sitting at the bottom of the river. The 18 hours had passed, and with them, the man he had spent 40 years constructing. He was no longer the muscular kingpin in the velvet booth, he was a ghost, a fragment of the man who had once climbed a burning fire escape. The ripples of grace had finally reached the shore, allowing him to choose a path that didn't involve blood or shadows. He had traded his iron throne for the terrifying, beautiful uncertainty of a clean slate, proving that even a life built on darkness could be redirected by a single, remembered act of light. Miles away, in a quiet park far from the jurisdiction of her former life, Anarcha Green sat on a bench and watched the sun begin to bleed over the horizon. Her career as a special agent was effectively over, her badge a cold weight she had surrendered to the internal affairs officers only hours before. She faced a future of desk jobs and quiet scrutiny, a life far removed from the high-stakes adrenaline of the hunt. Yet, as the first rays of light touched her face, the protective expression she had carried for 15 years finally softened into a look of absolute peace. She had compromised her duty, but she had saved her soul. In the end, she hadn't just repaid a life debt. She had validated the humanity of the man who had saved her, ensuring that his one moment of weakness became his ultimate strength. The world would remember Marzio Trentino as a criminal who vanished, but would remember him as the man who reached through the smoke. Her conscience was finally clear, a quiet sanctuary that no file or investigation could ever touch. The story that began with a trembling hand and a whispered warning ended in the stillness of a new dawn, where two people, separated by the law but joined by a memory, finally found the freedom to be better than their worst impulses.